Good evening, everyone. We are continuing our story of the life of Christ, and we're right in the middle of the so-called lost years, where Jesus is now in India. I started that last session, and we're going to go much farther with that today. So let's begin with a prayer. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, friend, beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, beloved Master Paramhansa Yogananda, saints of all religions, dear friend Swami Kriyananda, humbly we bow to you all. Help us to feel your presence, the presence of all the masters, but especially be with us, dear Jesus, in this season of your birth and in the eternity of your loving concern for us. Help us to understand on a very deep level the purpose of your life in that incarnation and the enduring purpose of your place on the altar and our responsibility and our potential as your disciples in this life and in who knows how many lifetimes before. We are your children. Guide us and bless us. Om. Peace. Amen. I've been in a little bit of a dilemma as I've gone through this class series. The first class I was really sort of flailing about trying to figure out how to run this, and I think from the second class on I've been more at ease with what I'm doing. It's been a little confusing for me for a very odd reason, which is I'm so used to free-forming that having an agenda, having pictures, having music and all of those things, having to confine my flow to a particular riverbed has sometimes been just a little betwixt and between. And I'm trying to walk a balancing act between, let's say the inspiration for this series was to in some way replicate in a virtual, I don't like that word virtual. I've never liked that word virtual because the experience is real. It's not virtual. But through this medium of film and internet conversation, the experience of actually being on these holy sites and photographs and music and reminiscence and reminding, all of that has been part of that. On the other side of it, there's just this whole dimension of the teachings of Jesus and the actual experience of the disciples. And in this particular section that we're in, which is Jesus in India, there's a lot of interesting history and historical facts and unknown realities. And so I'm always trying to walk the fine line between just the bhakti of loving Jesus and feeling his presence and, wow, isn't this interesting? So tonight we're going to be threading that same needle again. But I feel that many of you, as I do, when we have a deeper understanding, one of the issues about Jesus being on our altar is just really trying to understand between Christianity and the original teachings of Jesus. That's how Master put it forward. He came to restore, to teach the original teachings of Jesus and the original teachings of Krishna. He didn't spare the eastern side of it. The original teachings of Krishna, which have also, to a very large extent, been lost in Hinduism, and the original teachings of Jesus, which have, to a very large extent, been lost in Christianity, and to show what those great masters actually taught, and then also to show that they taught the same thing. So one of the anomalies of course, the life of Christ, as we were talking about last time we were together, is that the Bible stops at the age of 12 and then resumes again at the age of whatever it was, 29 or 30, when he shows up again. Jesus comes back to Israel. And it's just kind of crazy. That imagine, I mean, the disciples were with him even for those years. You think nobody ever asked? Like, hey, where were you? I mean, it's just the whole concept that there would be nothing in the Bible. And I have to say, it caused me to laugh last session, and I've been laughing about it ever since. Jesus defies his parents to stay in Jerusalem to teach at the temple. He just has no regard whatsoever for the fact that they've left the city of Jerusalem without him. He doesn't even bother to tell them he's not returning with them. They find him in the temple. They're quite upset that he stayed behind and didn't tell them. I mean, think about it, really. It's like, it was very rude of Jesus on a certain hand, if you think about it, but he probably knew his parents wouldn't allow him to stay. And then he was surprised that they expected him to be with them. And he says, don't you know I have to be about my Father's business? And he did not mean Joseph, he meant his heavenly Father, that I was not born to be your son. I was born to live a very different life. But he does go back with his parents. And then the Bible says, and from that point he went and lived with his parents and was obedient to them. It made me just laugh when I read it. He had absolutely defied them in the most incredible way. And then added to that, and I'm repeating myself from last session, but I myself have enjoyed these thoughts. Master said they tried to arrange a wedding for him and he didn't want to get married. So he ran away. And the Notovich scroll, it's not really the Notovich scroll, but Notovich was the first man to publicize it in the West in the late 1800s. He was a Russian traveler and scholar and was interested in this, and he publicized it, this scroll that he found in this Tibetan monastery, and it said exactly the same thing. It was the age when Jewish men when marriages were arranged, and Jesus ran away instead. I mean, so we get a very different picture. So last week, there in the Notovich scripture, scroll, which I'm going to talk about a little bit more. They talk about three primary places where Jesus was during those 18 years, actually in Gujarat, which I didn't bother to get pictures of, but he was up in the Himalayas, which is where you would expect, because Master said he came back to visit Babaji Lahiri and Sri Yukteswar, and the Himalayas are the traditional place where sages and yogis live outside of ordinary life. He also went to the city of Varanasi, Benares, the oldest inhabited city in the world. No one knows how old it is. It just has always been there. And we were looking at pictures of the old buildings by the Ganges. The buildings are not as old as Jesus, but the Ganges is as old as Jesus, and you can feel that energy. And the notable point about Varanasi especially, and Jaganath Temple, which is where we're going next, is that the Indian culture is a continuous culture. They can verify back thousands of years and find evidence of the same essential beliefs and practices. So it according to what is written in the Notovich scripts and other places, it was essentially the same. It wasn't Hinduism, though. It was Sanatana Dharma, which is the eternal truth, which is where Christianity, Hinduism, in other words, the original teachings of Jesus, the original teachings of Krishna come together. We'll talk about that in a moment. So first, I want to just visit, through photographs, the Jaganath Temple and just get a feel for that, because that was also a very important place where things happened to Jesus. Now, the Jaganath Temple, well, we might as well, let's start with the pictures and I'll just explain it as we go along.
Do you want to do I Wonder?
Oh, I forgot entirely. My dear friend Keshava reminds me that I wanted to start, thank you, I wanted to start this evening with one of Swami's wonderful songs, and we can again enjoy the picture of Jesus as a meditating yogi. To remind you, that picture of Jesus that you'll see as a meditating yogi, there was a Ramakrishna disciple named Trigunatithananda, who went to the Hemis monastery, and there he was shown two paintings that were said to be of Jesus when he was in India. And one of them was him talking at the well to the Samaritan woman, and the other was Jesus meditating with the creatures all around him. And when he came back to America, because even though that Swami was Indian, he was assigned to live in America, he described the picture and had an artist draw it, and that's what this picture is. So this is Jesus in India, and Swamiji's song, "Father, Now That I Wander With Thee," seemed exactly the right way to sort of feel the spirit of that picture. Now, I should tell you, one of the people who helps generally to put this class on the internet, Sai Ganesh, is in seclusion this week. So Keshava's doing double duty, and where that comes in is, at various times we have to, in order to show pictures, we have to move you out of the Zoom room, I guess, and then let you back in. And so it might be a little slower than it usually is because Keshava's doing double duty. And if that happens, be patient. We are still here. You can get back. Okay, let's now enjoy this picture of Jesus and Swami's beautiful song.
Father, now that I wander with thee, flowers and fields seem alive with thy joy. All that I owned to thee I've given, now I sing in thy love, I am free. Father, now that I dance in thy name, birds and animals shared in my song. All my sorrows, all my merriment, join in music to set hearts aflame. Father, now that I wander with thee, flowers and fields seem alive with thy joy. All that I owned to thee I've given, now I sing in thy love, I am free. Father, now that I dance in thy name, birds and animals share in my song. All my sorrows, all my merriment, join in music to set hearts aflame. All my sorrows, all my merriment, join in music to set hearts aflame.
Don't you just love the idea of Jesus? I mean, we think of him in such a different way. You know, so much of his life is also defined by the crucifixion and the resurrection. But there he was 14 years old when he went to India. And he was a highly advanced yogi and long since recognized and had already been teaching the elders. There's so many parallels between the life of Jesus as we're coming to really understand it, and the life that Master describes in Autobiography of a Yogi, where he was visiting different saints and teachers. And as Master, in the autobiography, Master presents himself, as Swami says, as a humble devotee. But Master said, in truth, they were all asking him questions. And that's exactly how you see the youth of Jesus. According to Edgar Cayce, the Essene teachers realized they didn't have anything to teach him. And then even as a young man, he's sitting in the temple and he's answering the questions that the elders can't answer. And then at the age of 14, he goes to India, and the Notovich scroll says that he became known almost immediately throughout all of India. So now we actually want to go to look at the Jaganath Temple. So we'll have the third image of the places that were described where Jesus spent a great deal of time. So let's look at those pictures now. The Jaganath Temple is located in the city of Puri, which, as it happens, is also the city where Sri Yukteswar had his seaside ashram. And in Autobiography of a Yogi, Master talks about spending a great deal of time in the city of Puri at the ashram of his guru, which is near, relatively near, the Jaganath Temple. The Jaganath Temple was built in about the 10th century, but it's been a pilgrimage spot for as long as anybody knows. And it is considered to just be this holy location on the planet. When Sri Yukteswara was buried, after he had his own Mahasamadhi, and he left his body sitting in the lotus posture, and so his body was put into the sand in the garden of the Puri ashram, where he lived in a mandir, a wonderful mandir was built over it. He was put into the ground facing the Jaganath Temple, because it had always been such a holy place. Puri is a pilgrimage spot in general, and I'm so ignorant of these things, I don't even know which ocean it is, but it's right on the ocean, an ocean. And so let's say the next picture. These are just pictures of the beach there. Bathing in the holy waters is very auspicious, and it does. I've been there many times because of our pilgrimage trips to Sri Yukteswar's ashram. I'm just standing by this ocean and wading into this ocean. These holy places really are exactly that. So now we'll go to the Jaganath Temple itself, which is not quite on the beach, but it's near the ocean. Let's go to the next picture. The Jaganath Temple, at the time of Jesus, as I will talk about, and now, is very, very orthodox. And Westerners are not allowed into it. Somebody was reminding me that I believe Swami received special permission to go in. But if you're not born a Hindu, you're not allowed in the temple. When we went there, so this is actually a view that you can get of the temple from buildings that are close to it, where you can stand and you can look in, which I've done many times, but have never been on the grounds. When our guide heard, one of our early trips there, our Indian guide heard that we weren't allowed into the temple. He had been traveling with us, and he was so impressed by our devotion and the depth of our understanding of the culture of India that he just couldn't accept that we wouldn't be allowed in. So he actually went to the priests and the officials, and he argued that we were as Hindu as anyone he knew, and that we certainly had the proper reverence and should be allowed in. And afterwards he came to us, and you should know that our guide, Sanjay Arora, was a very determined man. He said, no, absolutely no way, no price, no influence is ever going to get you into that temple. And this is relevant because later, when I start talking about Jesus' time there, because the prejudices were just as strong and firm when Jesus was there, and he ended up on the outs with these very priests or their ancestors. So this temple is dedicated, and we'll see the image in a minute, to Lord Jaganath, the Lord of the universe. And inside the temple there, and I'm just saying this because I've been told, there's 3 images, and they're carved out of wood. And it's Jaganath and his brother and his sister. And they're very unusual looking images, as we'll see in just a moment. So let's just look at other parts of the temple. These huge towers of a particular type. As I said, I believe this was built in the 10th century, and it was built over something that was already there. Let me see. When we get to the images, I'll say more about it. Yes, it was rebuilt from a 10th century building that was there in the 10th century. So let's go on to the next picture. Very unusual architecture you can see here. You can see there's some tiny men up at the top. That gives you an idea of the scale of what you're looking at. Okay, let's move it again. The whole temple, even when you just view it from the roof of the building, it has this aura about it. It's not merely its size and its enormous scope, but there's just power there. There's just no doubt. You just standing on the rooftop looking down, you really feel like you're someplace extraordinary. So let's look at the next picture. These are just various parts of the grounds. All of this, I have to say, are just pictures that I found. I've seen it from a distance. Let's go on to the next. Now, these are the images. Jaganath is the right one on the right as we face it with the black face. That's his sister Subhadra with the yellow face, and his brother Balabhadra with the white face. And Jaganath's eyes are round, representing the sun and the moon, they say, and his brother and sister both have almond-shaped eyes. These are carved out of particular kind of neem wood, and very unusually, I mean, they're not, as you can see, they're not complete. They don't have arms. They're primarily the faces. Let's go to the next picture because you'll get some idea of the scale of these. See how big these images are? And they, let me see how to say it. Every 12 to 18 years, when certain of the priests get the inspiration, they go out into the forest and they find neem logs, and it's all very intuitively done, and they find new pieces of wood and they recarve and repaint the images. They repaint the faces, they say, every year. And these are considered to be living beings. This particular scene here is a particular ritual they follow where they take them outside. Once a year, they travel from the temple where they normally live to their aunt's temple, which is about 3 kilometers away. They're put into a huge chariot, and the devotees pull the chariot the 3 kilometers down this huge straight boulevard to the aunt's house where they go to have a little bit of a vacation. And it's called the Jaganath Festival. The English word Jaganath actually came out of that because the power of that chariot being pulled down. It's a juggernaut. Nothing can stand in its way. And that's where the word came from. Let's flip to the next picture also. Again, and these images are dressed and bathed and fed and put to rest. They're living beings, and they have to be cared for in the same way as living beings. Why they look like this, there's many different theories about why they look like that and what it means. He's said to be an incarnation of Vishnu, although some say he's an incarnation of Shiva. When you get involved in a lot of these deities, the Western minds sort of either or, it has to be this, it has to be that, what's the true theology? It's much more fluid, created by the devotee. So let's go, I think there's one more image here. This is, of course, just photoshopped together, but you have the Jaganath and his sister and his brother superimposed over a picture of the temple. So this was the place, and presumably images like this, you know, we can't really say for sure, but at the time that Jesus was there were many idols, there were many images of gods and goddesses who were all the Brahminical tradition of all this worship and so on was very strongly in place. So we can't say exactly what Jesus was experiencing, but this at least gives us some feeling for it. So while we enjoy this last picture, let's listen to a melody that Swami wrote to a traditional chant to Lord Vishnu, Om Namo Narayan.
Om Namo Narayana, Om Namo Narayan, Om Namo Narayana, Om Namo Narayan, Om Namo Narayana, Om Namo Narayan, Om Namo Narayana.
just the picture of those images which are worshipped as divinity, which are in and of themselves so unusual, even for someone like myself who's quite, well, actually not really, because I've never really lived in India, but just sort of, I've moved through that culture and I feel fairly comfortable in it. They're still, they're not Western. And then we hear Om Namo Narayan, which is, a beautiful melody Swami wrote, beautifully chanted, led by Dharmadas, that kirtan. And it's just not Christian. I mean, there's just no part of it that connects you to Jesus the way we normally think about Jesus, which is one of the things I'm going to be talking through this evening about how all this happened. I want to tell you now this story, which actually comes a little bit geographically later, but it fits in here right now. When we get to John the Baptist, which will probably not be this session, but next session, one of the places we're going to go to is this cave in Ain Karam, in the hills of Ain Karam, where John the Baptist was said to have secluded for long periods of time. It's now a Franciscan convent is built around it, as you'll see, and there's some priests associated with it. And on the last January, a year ago, when we were in Israel, I was part of two pilgrimages, as I've said. First was Americans, and the second was a group of Indian devotees of Master. But almost everyone in that group was from India, except for me and Dambar and a couple of others. But we went to this cave, and the cave, it was just big enough to hold our whole group, which was about 40 people. And it's relative, there was not much activity going around there. I'd been there several times before, and usually there's just almost no one around. Maybe a sister greets you, and you can just go in and go into this cave. So we sat down in the cave, we filled it. There weren't any other visitors. And so we were filled from the back of the cave all the way to the door. And Shurjo, who was with me, who's the Ananda leader with his wife Narayani in Mumbai, he was there, and he and I were at the far end sitting at the doorway. And Dambar was mostly leading the chanting, but it was an Indian group, and they were more in tune with the way Shurjo chanted. The harmonium comes all the way back to Shurjo, who's at the opposite end of the cave. He picks it up and he starts playing in his own way, and he starts singing a chant, and probably it was in Hindi. It was a translation. It might have been Joya, 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 translated into Hindi. And he was singing it very vigorously, and all the Indians were in tune with what he was doing, and it was a very joyous, very devotional, very joyous chant. But we're right in the doorway, so the sound of it is going out as well as staying in the cave. So just as he finishes, we're about to meditate, and I'm sitting there on the door jamb, and I look up, and there's this priest. He was very large. It just somehow, he loomed at least, and he loomed in the doorway, and he said, "This is a Christian place," he said like that. And thank you, God, just the words that came out of me, like a little girl, I said, "We're here for Jesus." And then he said, and I said, "We were about to meditate." "Well, it had better be a Christian meditation," he said to me. Once again, I said, "We're here for Jesus." And there was nothing he could do, so he had to sort of humph a little bit and then stomp off. But afterwards I just laughed. Of course, it was a perfect response, and it was given to me by God, but really. But here's the history of all that. So now let's talk about the history of that, about sort of how we got there and why Master incarnated to fix it. We really have to understand that Master incarnated to fix this. And it's one of the things he specifically stated. This is what I'm here to do, because it's just been so confused. And Hindus are just as prejudiced. There's an equally narrow-minded wave of sectarian energy coming out of India now too. Everybody has forgotten Sanatana Dharma. So I wanted to start with this whole revelation about Jesus even being in India. Very interestingly, see, Sri Yukteswar described the shifting of the yugas, and Sri Yukteswar revised what was common understanding in India. There was, as it happened, when at the transition between Dwapara and Kali Yuga, which was the Mahabharata and the war that was associated there, and at a certain point, all the sages and wise people either left the planet or went off to the forest, and a lot of misunderstanding began to come in. So the tradition was that Kali Yuga would be going on for 100,000 or 200,000 years. And so those of us who only ever learned about the yugas from Sri Yukteswar have not been involved in that controversy. But if you grew up in the Indian culture, Sri Yukteswar's assertion that Dwapara Yuga would be starting, that the transition into Dwapara would be start in 1700 and Dwapara proper would start in 1900, it was controversial. It wasn't like everybody just agreed. Again, Sri Yukteswar was restoring an understanding that had been lost during the depths of Kali Yuga. So Nodovich, going to India, going up to the Hemis monastery in Ladakh, which now is a Buddhist monastery, but you have to understand, at the time of Jesus, it was about 400 years or so after Buddha's incarnation, according to as far as anybody can tell. But Buddhism, per se, had not yet defined itself. You know, Buddha, Krishna, Jesus, these are all self-realized masters. There's a word for it in India, sampradaya. Sampradaya means a particular lineage from an enlightened person that comes from the same truth, but then becomes this unique expression because it's the disciples and then the disciples of this particular enlightened master. And in the true tradition of Sanatana Dharma, you have all these different lineages, but they don't divide up into different religions. And they certainly don't argue with each other. They're just different families within the great family of God. So at the time of Jesus, Buddhism per se just didn't exist in the way that it exists now. It was a sampradaya. There were disciples of Buddha who were following Sanatana Dharma, just like the disciples of all the other masters were doing. And apparently even the Buddhism itself hadn't even reached Tibet, what to speak of there being a definite Tibetan Buddhism. So all of those distinctions were not there. But Tibet, because it was so isolated for so many hundreds and hundreds of years, and there was this continuous reverential ancient tradition which was never interfered with because it was a very closed culture, a lot of very ancient things have been preserved through that. And that's how this scroll, which according to the monk who shared it with Nodovich, said the original was in Lhasa, but this was a copy of it. And everybody in the monastery knew about it. It was just everyone knew that everyone associated with that particular lineage was aware that there were these scrolls, and they were all about the life of this saint who was called Isa. Master said that Isa was Jesus' actual name, and that it became shifted into the word Jesus, but Isa was really what it was called, which simply means Lord. That's what the word means. He was Christ. That was another word for Christ. He was called the Christ. The word Krishna also is Christ. So when Jesus went there, he was recognized as a Christ, and they called him Lord. They called him Isa. So they say that, and these are just a few more details I don't think I was shared with you before. They say that this scroll was written just 3 or 4 years after Jesus' crucifixion. And it was spoken by people who had known Jesus, including some eyewitnesses to his crucifixion. This is the tradition behind it, because the Essenes had this connection with India. This is what I was talking about last week. The community, last time, the community from which Jesus sprang was an esoteric brotherhood of devotees, and they were deeply connected to India. I think when the 3 wise men showed up at the manger, or wherever they, if it was a few years later, it's not clear exactly when, the sentimental tradition is that they all came on the night of Jesus' birth, but other traditions say it might have been a little bit later. inasmuch as Herod killed all the babies who were 3 years and younger. It implies that the wise men came a little bit later. But it doesn't matter because there was this flow. And because Jesus had spent 18 years in India and had been very well known and well respected, everyone was interested in what happened to him because he was a great teacher in their country, and then he went back to his point of origin. He was called by God to go back to the country of his origin, where his mother was still living, and to carry out the rest of his mission. So the people in India wanted to know. And I'm going to talk about it in a few minutes, but one of the apostles, Thomas, went to India right after Jesus died. And so it is also believed that much of this scroll was either written by Thomas or dictated by Thomas. It was guided by him. And he was one of the apostles. He was one of Jesus' followers who had been through the whole story of Jesus and then was sent by Jesus. And again, I'll talk about that in a minute. So this was just a little bit more about what was understood to be the origin of this scroll. And it does talk, as I have said, about he was in the Himalayas, he was in Varanasi, he was in the Gujarat area, and then he was also at the Jaganath Temple. Now, Jesus did not just come and sort of relax and support what was going on. Bear in mind, we're in Kali Yuga descending, and so everything is beginning to get more and more rigid. The nadir of Kali Yuga was 500 AD. So 500 years after the death of Jesus, for 500 years it kept going down. And India, like the rest of the world, was becoming more and more materially defined. And I don't just mean materialistic, but just more rigid, more form becomes more important. And the caste system, which was originally a spiritual aid for people to understand, it was a template for understanding levels of spiritual development and how best to work with one's own nature or work with the nature of the people around you to help people rise. But as Swami described it, and as Kali Yuga began to descend, those who were at the top of the caste heap, especially the Brahmins and the Kshatriyas, it started becoming hereditary. Rather than based on a person's actual nature, it became hereditary. And of course, the children of Brahmins are not necessarily Brahmins, but the Brahmins enjoyed all this status and they wanted their children to enjoy it. So gradually, instead of it being an avenue to freedom, it became an avenue for oppression. And the more, the farther away the caste system got from the real divine inspiration of it, the more the Brahmins became the custodian of religion. And of course, that's a position of tremendous power. And the more the Brahmin caste becomes hereditary, the more power the Brahmin caste has, the more the original intention, which is a Brahmin is someone who is a servant of God and is in tune with divine inspiration, it becomes about power and position. So what had begun to develop by the time Jesus was there was that the Brahmins and the Kshatriyas owned the spiritual tradition, and the Vaishyas and the Shudras were excluded from it. Now, this had its origin point in truth, which is at the Shudra level, the esoteric philosophy can actually be confusing instead of helpful. But once it's all hereditary, it's not happening that way anymore. So the Brahmins and the Kshatriyas are owning these higher teachings, and the Vaishyas and the Shudras are specifically excluded from them. Jesus didn't really think that that was such a great idea. So he started teaching everyone the same teaching. And in the Notovich scroll, which I'm reading this from Abbot George, his website, the Original Christianity, Original Yoga. He calls it OCOY. And it's fascinating to peruse. I talked about it last week, and I'm working from things Master said, things that are in a film by a man named Richard Bach, who was a Sai Baba disciple who drew from other sources. I'll talk to you about it in a moment. Abbot George, Edgar Cayce, Swami Kriyananda. And I'm convinced myself that there's sufficient truth in this. But Abbot George, who actually has an English version of Notovich's scroll, which Notovich himself published, but he warns us that it's been translated from whatever the original language is into Tibet, into a language called Pali, translated into Russian, into French, into English. So the history, the way Father George puts it, he says the history is probably true. The teachings, the exact wording of Jesus' teachings could easily have been changed. But it's the history that really interests us because we know Jesus' teachings from Master. We don't have to go back to this original scroll to know. There's nothing in there that's inconsistent at all, of course. But the history of it is that Jesus saw socially oppressed people, which is exactly what happened when he went back to Israel. He saw that the Romans were oppressing, and there was a priesthood in Israel and in Jerusalem that was just like the Brahmin priesthood, which is they had gotten into a position of power and money, and they were controlling the spiritual lives of everyone else, and they were controlling it as much for their own benefit as they were for the benefit of the people. And Jesus was an avatar, and he was not going to accept that. So he freely associated, just as he did in Israel. See, the story is just the same. He freely associated with the lower caste people, and he freely broke the rules by sharing the scriptures with them and sharing the highest teachings with them. And of course, they loved him for it because he was one of them. He was a great saint. He loved everyone. And in the scroll itself also talks about how exceedingly lovable Jesus was. It's very sweet that he had a very loving and a very gentle nature. The person described is very much the person that's described elsewhere. And it was said to be an eyewitness account of the disciples who knew Jesus in Israel, who was exactly then the same man, and then those who knew him in India spoke of him this way. But when he finally got to the Jaganath Temple, and he was not cooperating with the Brahminical traditions there, he had a great deal of power, spiritual power. Now, this is exactly the same story that plays itself out in Israel, is that Jesus was giving people the direct truth, and he spoke against too much reverence for the idols. Swami talks about the true understanding of these images is that they are an expression of the ideals of the divine. They give a focus for the spiritual truth. For example, Ganesha, which is not part of this conversation, but Ganesha is the elephant-headed god, and Ganesha is the remover of obstacles. And so when you have a difficulty in your life and you want God's help, Ganesha is your messenger. You speak to Ganesha when your particular need is for the removing of obstacles. This is really not at all different, although the Catholics would never accept this, from declaring so-and-so is the saint of lost items, or so-and-so is the saint of television, or so-and-so is the saint of automobiles. These are all true things. And so if you have a particular need in that way, then you appeal to that particular saint. Well, the deity, so to speak, it was the same thing. It was just ideal aspects of the divine are personified. This is all necessary in Kali Yuga, because in Kali Yuga, it's not possible for the consciousness of man as a whole to understand these abstractions. They have to be translated. Thus the epics, thus the deities, thus the incredible stories about the deities. It all actually works really well. I had a very interesting experience of this when I was at this temple outside of Delhi. I forget now what we called it, but whatever we called it, it wasn't really even the name of the temple. But it was a very lavish, multi-acre place with a lot of different temples to different aspects of the divine, and some very nice art, bas-reliefs carving on the walls that had incidences from the life of various saints and from the epics and things like that. And I was sitting in one of those temples that happened to be round, and some aspects of the story of perhaps Lord Rama were described picture by picture. And I was sitting there, and a group of what I will call villagers, and that's the word that other Indians would use, meaning people who were less educated, who still lived in a simpler way. And this temple served those people a lot. They came in, and I don't know if they were even literate. I don't know whether they were or not, and I don't know what language they were literate in. But they understood the pictures. And they saw the picture of Lord Rama doing this or Lord Rama doing that. And they were so excited. And I do not know how I managed the language issue, but it was perfectly clear what was happening. And they so enjoyed picture by picture. And you could see that it was all very inspiring to them, because it reminded them of these high principles. Master himself talks about his spiritual education, and his ethical and moral education came from his mother telling him selected incidences from the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. And sometimes she would discipline him by referring to those events. So there's a real place for it. But it was distorted. And Jesus felt that just as when he came back to Israel, the laws were being used to oppress the people rather than to liberate them. And in India, the Brahminical traditions and the ritual worship were being used to oppress people rather than to free them. And so Jesus just cut through all of that. So what happened to him at the Jaganath Temple was he gradually enraged the Brahmins, because all the people were beginning to follow him and not listen to them. They saw an erosion of their power, and they planned to kill him. They just needed to get rid of him. I'm sure they had created a belief that he was a heretic who was a threat to the religion. That's how it always works. But what happened was the Shudras warned Jesus that there was a plot afoot, and they spirited him out of town, and he just left town and went into another part of India. Now, there's even more that's told. According to Casey, Edgar Casey, Jesus was in India from the time that he was 14 until he was 26. And then for 3 years, he went to other countries nearby, specifically and especially Persia and Egypt, both of which were were places where there were very high and wise sages and saints, and the true teachings of Sanatana Dharma were still in place. Casey talks about the pyramids and just a deep understanding of many principles that Jesus also immersed himself in at that time. But it was all the same. It was the same Sanatana Dharma teaching. It's not like Jesus went around in a sort of eclectic way, picked up a little of this and a little of that. It was all one explanation is it was all the Essene Brotherhood, or whatever you would call that, where these spiritual people all knew each other, and he moved from place to place. Now every time I talk about this, I don't want us to move into a far-fetched reality. Think of Ananda. People, you can go from here, you can go to Italy, you can go to Germany, you can go to Sweden, you can go to South Africa, you can go to Australia, you can go to New Zealand, and you just let it be known that you're coming, and the Ananda devotees will find you there. And you will live in the same reality that we live in here. You'll move through worlds that are completely incompatible to it, but then you will find your brothers and your sisters. Now just imagine that in each of those places, or at least in some of those places, it's not merely other devotees, but it's also highly advanced enlightened souls who themselves are spreading the great light of divine understanding. And you could easily want to go somewhere to sit at the feet of and to learn, or to teach. whatever it might be. But that was, according to Casey, he was in India, then he moved to Persia. Now in the story about Persia, this is actually, I believe this is in Notovich's script, yes. It's in Notovich's script, that he got in trouble with the priests there too, that he was doing the same thing, because he was not honoring the forms that had begun to develop during Kali Yuga. And I believe it was about Zoroastrianism or whatever it was, which is a true Sanatana Dharma teaching, but it had assumed a certain form, and Jesus was teaching a universal spirituality, and he also riled up the priests there. Now Casey throws in another marvelous little bit here, which is, where is John the Baptist during all of this? And now if we have that John the Baptist was Elijah, and that he was actually the guru of Jesus, did John just throw Jesus off to India and then just ignore him for all those 18 years? Some of the traditions say that John went with him, that he traveled with him. Now, we have the three wise men being Sri Yukteswar, and we had this confusion that we talked about last time, like how could if John the Baptist was in fact Sri Yukteswar, was Sri Yukteswar in two bodies at that time? Did he manifest an extra one? Did John go with Jesus to India? Casey says at least John was with Jesus in Egypt. And Casey puts a tremendous amount of energy into, just in general, much that happened in Egypt, and the high nature of the teaching at that time, and the active power of the pyramids. All of these things are so far beyond my ability to actually articulate, but they are fascinating, and there's a fascinating aspect about Egypt, which, if you think of the Yuga cycle, it's a circle, but if you think of the bottom half of the circle, and you start on the descending side, and you sort of start down, and you go down to the nadir of Kali Yuga, then you start up the other side, you end up, if you have a circle, or the bottom half of a circle, which would be a U, you have a certain point of Kali Yuga or Dwapara Yuga descending, and on this side you would have a certain point of Kali Yuga rising and Dwapara Yuga rising. At a certain point, you're going to be at the same level. And so it's often been asserted that many of the mysteries of Egypt will be revealed when our civilization of Earth matches the level at which the pyramids were an active spiritual reality. So even just the very idea, and see, this is what this whole evening is about, is just like opening our minds to all of these possibilities. I cannot be definitive, but I can just open all these windows and sort of say, and Master said this, and Edgar Casey said that, and the Notovich scroll said this, and I don't find it necessary to bring any of this to a focus, because we have Master to really present the teachings of Jesus. We're not desperately trying to either prove that Jesus was a self-realized master or any of that, but what I'm trying to do for myself, and I hope you enjoy it too, is just like, there's just so much more. There's so many more possibilities here, and the real story is so much more interesting than these sort of rigid tales that we're working with. And these themes of the way Jesus was a renegade, and he was always upsetting the apple cart of the conventional way of doing things. So, and then there's this question of Egypt. Where does it lie? What is it? Swami himself, when he went to Egypt, he didn't go with any real expectation, but in fact he had very deep experiences there. And he said, when he really tuned in on a deep level, he said the whole culture of Egypt, everything we know about Egypt was after it had begun to disintegrate. He said when he really tuned into what he felt was the height of the Egyptian culture, he said it was very joyous. He said the whole landscape, it wasn't a desert. It was very green, and it was very joyous, and it was Sanatan Dharma, of course. The desert nature of Egypt, this is how Swami's put it at other times, is that in Kali Yuga descending, the power that had been there from Dwapara Yuga became corrupted, and it turned into black magic, Swami said. And when a desert sweeps in, it's purifying. It's this energy, this huge purifying energy. So he felt that it's being purified from the misuse of power. And then as the yuga rises, that purification may end, and because those monuments are still there. And the secrets of those monuments, everybody's guessing, but nobody really knows. So Casey throws in that John the Baptist and Jesus were there. And. Okay, and they also, the one interesting thing about the Notovich scroll, because it does talk about the crucifixion and the death of Jesus, is that it blames Pilate more than it blames the priests. Pontius Pilate, it acts more like Jesus was a threat to the government. I'm not sure why that's in there, and I'm beyond myself to make a declaration. But generally speaking, it was too true, both in Jaganath and at the Jaganath Temple, and also in Persia, according to this, and you'll see in a few moments Thomas the Apostle too. It's other religionists who see the power of a spiritual person. It's rarely the secular government. In fact, it's never the secular government, because they don't take spiritual power seriously. They see armaments and money, and rabble-rousing crowds. I mean, that's what politics and government is about. When someone is just preaching divine love, there's tremendous power there, but it's much more of a threat to a corrupt priesthood than it is to a government. But it's an interesting point. The story is pretty much the same, except the priests in Israel come off a lot better than they do in the Gospels. So it was just an interesting change. Now, so having said all of that, now I want to talk about, and this is a little out of sequence, but I think it's helpful right in this context to understand. So it is a known fact that after Jesus died, the apostles were now 11, because Judas had betrayed, so they had been 12. Now they were 11, but they elected a 12th apostle. So the 12 apostles were there, and they were empowered on the day of Pentecost, and then they were inspired to carry the good news of Jesus' life and resurrection out to everyone who would listen. Now, this is all happening within the Jewish community. This is all happening primarily within the Essene community, within the Jewish community. This is relevant when we get much later, when Jesus comes back to Israel. But they all got together to decide who would go where, and this is in the Acts of the Apostles. This isn't secret esoterica. But Thomas, who was known as Thomas the Doubter at one point, because when he was told that Jesus had resurrected, he said, "Until I see with my own eyes and can put my hand into the wound on his side," he said, "until then I won't believe." So they called him the Doubter, and then Jesus appeared to Thomas and said, "Here, put your hand into my wound." And then Thomas did believe. But before that, now I'm hesitate for a moment. The story is always told as if the assignment was given to Thomas before Jesus' crucifixion, rather than during the days after the resurrection, because Jesus appeared to the disciples for 40 days afterwards, intermittently for 40 days. But all the disciples were trying to decide where they should go and what they should do. But Thomas was not part of that discussion, because he already had his assignment, and his assignment was to go back to India, which is exactly what he did. He didn't stay in Israel like the others did and preach to the synagogues and try to, because for a long time Christianity was Judaism, and it was just the Messiah has come. It was the fulfillment of Judaism, and they tried to go to the various synagogues. That's a later story, and they weren't successful, and that's how it became Christianity, is that the people in the synagogues rejected them, and they were not going to be silenced, especially not Paul. So he went out and he converted others. But meanwhile, Jesus, there's no Jewish context for Thomas, because Thomas just goes to India. He goes to the south of India. There's some stories told about Thomas resisting and Jesus having to appear and force him to go, but I don't know whether that's true or not. So I had I had the interesting thought when I was reading this, because if Master was in fact Jesus, we can't help but ask the question, where was Swami Kriyananda during that incarnation? And many people tried to say that Swami was St. Paul, because there are parallels. Swamiji has carried the teachings of Master out in a way that, exactly in the same way that Paul did. Paul was at odds with his fellow disciples because he was doing things that they considered heretical, which is carrying the teachings of Jesus to the Gentiles and not keeping it orthodox among the Jewish community. So the life story of Thomas, but Swami always resisted the idea that he had been Paul in a previous lifetime. He had several points for it. One was, he thought that Paul would have been liberated by now, and that he wouldn't have reincarnated the way Swami did. That was one of his stories, which wasn't a very persuasive one. But the other one, he said, was just really funny. He said he never really liked Paul very much. And in a sense, the personality of Paul does not seem like Swami. It's just too forceful. And even in the life of Paul, he was a persecutor of the Jews. I mean, he even murdered the Jewish people who were following Christ because he was protecting the orthodoxy of Judaism, and they were a threat to it. But then he had a vision and so on, and that just doesn't sound like Swami. But Thomas sounds more like Swami. And the interesting thing of having a separate assignment from the Master than all the other disciples had also fits Swami's life. And just interestingly, that Thomas was for India. And when Swamiji had been with Master a very short time, Master talked about taking him to India. And for every year in Master's life, he was going to take Swami to India that year. And after Master died, and they never were able to go, in 1958, when SRF, with Dayamata as the president, decided it was time to go to India, she took Swami Kriyananda with herself and her sister and another nun, because that's what Master had wanted, that he should go to India. And that's why they left him there to teach. I'm just making that up. That thought came to me in April of 2013. In June, I was supposed to travel with Swami to Romania. And I was going to ask him about this theory about Thomas, because I had learned about it in between. But Swami, I wanted to talk to him in person. I didn't want to write it to him. But Swami passed away before the end of April, so I never got to ask him. So it doesn't matter whether it's literally true, but there are these patterns of disciples and what the disciples do. So here's the story, that Thomas goes to India, returns to India representing Jesus. Thomas was often called the twin, and they don't know whether that meant because he was spiritually a twin to Jesus, and some say that he actually literally looked like Jesus. But Jesus sending Thomas back was really sending his emissary. Now bear in mind, Jesus was extremely well known in India. He'd been there for 18 years. He was only gone for 3 years. So then Thomas comes back. And if in fact the Notovich scroll was created by Thomas, Thomas comes back and he writes the story. He tells everyone what happened, and he writes the rest of the story, and the story of what happened in India. He's filling in the history of his master. It would be the most natural thing in the world for him to do. So Thomas was in India continuously, except, and I'm not quite sure when this year was. Oh yes, it would have been around 52 after Jesus died, 52 years after 52 AD. So that seems like it's too long. It must be after the birth of Jesus. But when you say AD, we always say that after death. So was it 33 years? 20 years later? I'm not sure. Suddenly I'm lost, but it doesn't matter. So the Virgin Mary is going to leave her body, which is a whole story that we'll tell when we get a little closer. And either the message came to Thomas in India that the Virgin Mary was going to leave her body. Now, Mary remained the center of the life of the disciples. John took her into his house, remember? Well, you will know at the crucifixion, Jesus turned the responsibility of Mary over to his spiritual son, John. And from that point, the Bible says, John took Mary into his home and took care of her as a son would take care of his mother. And the disciples, the work of the disciples was all inspired and guided by Mary. And so when Mary was going to leave her body, this was extremely important to Thomas, so he began the journey back from Israel. But he actually arrived like 3 days after Mary had died. But he didn't know that because of the communication, and he was, right near where he was going to see her, and she appeared to him. And this is how the story is told. And she actually gave him her belt at that point. Even though she was appearing in vision, she gave him her belt, and he had it as a physical object that became an object of enormous veneration. And then he found out that she'd actually passed already before he had met her. So they told the story that this was the third day, and that Mary also resurrected and appeared to one of her disciples. So then Thomas is in Israel, and it's 52 AD, however that number has come to. And before he went back to India, Thomas visited some of the major Essene communities, and he said to them, he warned them that the Romans were going to move against the Jewish people, which in in the year 70 AD, the Romans completely destroyed the town of Jerusalem and completely destroyed the Jerusalem Temple. That was the second temple that had been destroyed by an alien force. And in the end, the Jewish people were either obliterated or completely dispersed. And until 1948, when Israel was again restored as a country, from that point on, it was the diaspora. The Jews were just spread all over the world, and they didn't have a homeland again until just 80 years ago, when they finally got a homeland again. So here's just another fascinating aspect of this. Thomas knew that this was coming, and it was less than 20 years from the time he was there when this happened. And he encouraged many of the Essenes to come back to him to India, and just get out of Israel because it wasn't going to be safe, and that go to this much more congenial and supportive country. Now, because Thomas has stepped into India and he's recognized as a sampradaya. It's a lineage of Sanatana Dharma. Jesus is recognized as an enlightened being, and Thomas is a highly advanced disciple. There's many stories of the miracles he worked and the power of his spirit, and he established a deeply devoted community of people devoted to Jesus, but it was totally integrated into Hindu society, and many of his followers were very highly placed, high caste people and Brahmins who continued to be Brahmins because there was no contradiction between what Jesus taught and what they were doing as Hindus. It was all Sanatana Dharma, and this was just another divine lineage. So Thomas said, we'll all go back and live there. And the tradition has that he brought a notable number of people with him who established villages. And if you put the Essene connection, it was just maybe they just moved into existing Essene communities. We don't know. And then in 70 AD, there was a rebellion, a Jewish rebellion, which was completely crushed. And the Jewish people were simply wiped out. One of the most intense stories about that was at the hilltop of Masada in Israel, the last remnant of these rebels isolated themselves at the top of this very defensible hill. This is one of the great stories of Jewish history, and it's one of the places that you can go visit, where these 900 something men, women, and children, and it's just a mesa on a very flat desert, and even the trail up to it was just a one-person snake trail and straight sides, very, very, very defensible, very difficult to invade. And in fact, Herod had built a palace up there, and they took over all the buildings that he had. Maybe they killed the people there, I don't know. But then the Romans set up a siege, and then the Romans built a ramp. And they just brought in tons and tons of earth, and the rebels at the top of the mountain watched them building this ramp over a period of months. And they knew that as soon as, because they were vastly outnumbered and outarmed, because the 900 was also women and children, and they knew that there was nothing they could do. So the story is that they chose death before dishonor. And they, as it's written, suicide was a sin, so they drew lots and they killed each other. But by the time the Romans came, everyone was dead, except for 2 women and 5 children who had hidden away and not participated in the death. This is a history that's written by a contemporary historian. So Thomas undoubtedly saw all that coming. And Thomas also, in a very practical way, he needed help. And so he wanted people who had been with Jesus, who understood Jesus, to come with him. And so they went back to India. So now, let me see how much time I have. I think I have time to finish this. So what happens is this completely other branch of the teachings of Jesus develops in India. And it develops as Sanatana Dharma. And over time, at first, there was a little bit of contact with other branches of Christianity, and the phrase began to be that they were Thomas Christians, because they had a different point of view, and they participated in Hindu culture as Christians, whereas in other parts of the world it was all beginning to define itself in a very different way. So what finally happens is, let me get my dates right here. Okay, so there's 2 things that are going on. Let me sort of back up in time to another place. About 300 years after Jesus' passing, when Constantine, who was an emperor, converted to Christianity and converted his whole country into Christianity, it became the state religion. And gradually, once the government gets involved, he wants to organize it. We're not going to be mystics anymore. We're not going to have all these different ways of doing things. We're going to have it all in order. So he called together what is known as the Nicene Council, and he wanted to unify the church and state and make them match more. So they discussed, what would be helpful for that intention and what would not be helpful. And there was this controversy going on. Now we're sinking down into the nadir of Kali Yuga. They're trying to understand what it means for Jesus to be the Son of God, because he said that. But so they decide on a theology, and that theology is that Jesus is the substance of the divine. He was begotten of the substance of the Father. I can't even argue the theology. But what it took out of it is that Jesus was no longer a self-realized master who had been, back many incarnations before, a man like us who had achieved self-realization. He was a special creation of God, and he'd never touched ordinary humanity. This, of course, is a very difficult theological point to defend because we don't understand this, and this was the beginning of the end of everything. At the beginning of Christianity, at the time of Judaism, reincarnation was a Jewish teaching. And there's a few places in the Bible, where it's clear that they still believe in reincarnation. Who was John the Baptist? The disciples say, how could you be the Messiah if Elijah hasn't been born again? And Jesus said, oh, Elijah came, and they just didn't know who he was. And they knew he meant John the Baptist. Now, if John the Baptist is there as John the Baptist, but they know he's Elijah, they're obviously talking about reincarnation. And in other places in the Bible, they asked Jesus, who were you in the past? Were you this master or this prophet or that one? All of it's perfectly reasonable questions if you think in terms of reincarnation. And Origen, who was an original Catholic theologian, he said the principle of reincarnation was handed down from apostolic times. The apostles themselves had it. Now, reincarnation is important because that's how a self-realized master becomes a Christ. But if Jesus was just made by God, there's never been one before and there'll never be one after, reincarnation, where does that fit into the whole thing? Plus, as Swami often put it, it makes it harder to control your flock if they can just be reborn again and get another chance. So a whole lot of theology started changing around 300, and that became Christianity. But meanwhile, over here in India, these people are not at all involved in that. They're Thomas Christians, and they're just Sanatan Dharma. They're completely devoted to Jesus, but to the original teachings of Jesus. So then what happened is in 1498, now see, we're moving up toward the end of the beginning of Dwapara, but we're not quite there. The Portuguese arrived in southern India. And the Portuguese had a very strong hold of southern India. And in fact, Goa, when India was formed, Goa was not originally part of the forming of India because it belonged to the Portuguese, not to the British. And the British are returning British India to the Indians, but they have no control over Goa. So Goa actually came into India a couple of decades later because the Portuguese held it. And that's why parts of southern India, not all of southern India, but Kerala and the Goa area, they're Christian, they're not Hindu. It's a very different area because the Portuguese came in 1498. Okay, and all of a sudden, the Portuguese are Roman Catholics. And they meet this whole sort of Jesus tradition that is completely outside of, it's integrated into Hinduism. It's totally upsetting to them, to put it mildly, depending. So it took about 100 years. But in 1599, there was a certain Archbishop of Goa, and he invited all of the clergy and the priests and a great many of the lay people. And a certain conflict started developing. There was arguments and persecution, and Portuguese had more power. They were taking over. And it wasn't working well. But 100 years later, the Archbishop of Goa invites all these all the people who are following Thomas Christianity to come together, and they're going to have a big reconciliation, is what this bishop says. And he wants them to bring their scriptures and all of this, and they're all going to get together. So they all come. All of their scriptures and all of their papers are confiscated, and everything is burned. And then that archbishop, and then he brutally coerced them to either, convert or submit in one way or another. Then that same archbishop went from church to church and just burned everything that he could burn. So that there's there's no trace, just no trace of this history that because they traced it back to the Apostle Thomas. And so how could how could the Portuguese priests defend themselves against a tradition that went all the way back to a direct disciple? So they obliterated it. And that's why it's very hard to find out. You don't have any writings of Thomas. You just don't know much of what happened there, because the Portuguese just completely wiped it out. And then gradually the Portuguese took over the society, and those who remained devoted to Jesus became Roman Catholics. And Catholics in the way that everybody, and then the Protestant missionaries came and just further diluted it. And so even though there are still pockets of what you might call Thomas Christians, in which they understand it as Sanatana Dharma, it just completely went away. So see, all of this is the history that tells us how we got to what we have now. Where just the very idea that Jesus was in India, it's just nobody knows what to do with it, except what was created in its place is not true. And so now that we're coming back up into Sanatana Dharma, now it's time, Master realized it's time. The followers of my church have forgotten who we really are. And so this is what we're trying to do now at this point. Now, at just a moment, I have to look through my own notes here. Here it is. This is what I'm looking for. I went to, there's a chapel. Oh, and then finally what happened to poor Thomas is he was martyred. And some say, it's the same story. Some say that he was martyred by the priests who were jealous of his power, because he was a true twin to Jesus, and he was able to do miracles and raise the dead and do that sort of thing, and they weren't able to. And so for them it was, it was too much of a threat. So his life was taken away from him. He was a martyr. And his body was buried. There's a big cathedral in Chennai, which is dedicated to St. Thomas, and underneath it there's a crypt where his body is said to be buried. I'm actually just looking here because I do have some pictures of that, but I don't seem to have the right notes for it at the moment. So what we'll do is, I'll start with that next week. We'll start with that. And so we'll end our evening right now with our closing song, which is, it's actually, the song is called Krishna's Flute, although the word Krishna is not anywhere in the song. Krishna's flute is actually the sound of the second chakra, and it's the inner sound that we hear when we are being called by God. And Krishna plays a flute because the flute sound is an inner sound. We don't hear the flute because Krishna's playing it. Krishna plays it in order to awaken us to the realization that the inner sounds that we're hearing is the call of God to us. So let's listen to Swamiji. Is it Swami singing this song? Let's listen to Swamiji calling us as Jesus was called, as the voice of Jesus calls us, and this wonderful coming together, finally, of these two strains of divine inspiration that were separated by man's ignorance and are now being brought together again by the grace of God.
I've heard your flute high on a cloud, your call I can't resist. Oh, let me come and play with you. We'll scatter music with the dew and sound the morning mist. I've heard you piping on a hill, all else I've set aside. Oh, let us dance the mountain peaks. We'll skip with breezes on the creeks and soar the valleys wide. Your flute has called me to the fields. Now I've no place to live. Don't send me back, rejected friend. Whatever I call mine must end. All that I am I give. I hear your flute in every tree, in every flower and stream, and sweetest melody of all, a song that heaven's joy recalls. Here in my heart you sing.